Welcome to Design Downtime, the podcast where we celebrate the joys of living a balanced creative life. I'm your host, Guy Siegel, a design director in Toronto, Canada, and I invite you to join me on this journey as we redefine what it means to be a successful design professional. Let's break free from the shackles of hustle culture and embrace the full spectrum of human experience, because life is too precious to be spent only in pursuit of productivity. Today, I'm excited to be talking with Ian Murchison. With a background as an industrial designer and as someone who has made the switch from the physical to the digital world, Ian has had the joy of working for some major brands like Blackberry and Nokia, while also building up his own consultancy, designing, building, and shipping award-winning products globally. Ian's work has crossed all scales, from products that are consumed by hundreds of millions to newborn ideas without a customer in sight. Ian is currently a principal designer working on the design system team at Autodesk. Beyond the 9-to-5, Ian focuses on the outdoors, not hiking or camping, but he started his own hop farm, providing locally sourced ingredients to craft breweries. He spends countless hours cycling in the countryside and, what we're going to talk about today, competing in FPV drone racing. Ian, welcome to the show.
Hey, Guy, thanks for having me. That's quite the intro.
I mean, you wrote it.
Yeah, I guess I did.
So as we said, as your bio said, we're going to talk about drone racing or FPV drone racing. What is that?
Yeah, so drone racing is kind of this subset of the whole drone culture. I mean, I think when people think about drones, they tend to think about, that little thing that they can go to Best Buy and buy for a couple $100, and they use their phone and they can fly it around their backyard. And FPV drone racing is kind of that on the extreme. Much like any type of racing, there are organized bodies to it, but essentially we're strapping goggles to our faces and there are little cameras on the drones, and we're seeing what the drone sees, and we're trying to fly through obstacle courses and compete on a time-based course. So it's quite interesting. It's very hard to do. It's a lot harder than I thought it would be to do. Growing up, I spent a lot of time racing remote control cars to the point that I actually built an off-road track in my backyard. I was getting kind of that competitive with it. And drone racing is so much harder than racing remote control cars. You kind of imagine it, but in a 3D space, right? Because you can not only go left and right, but you can go up and down at the same time. And it's really quite challenging.
So you mentioned that you started with, or you grew up playing with remote control cars. How did you get introduced to drones? I'm assuming that was a bit of a later time in life.
Yeah, I mean, drone technology, has definitely accelerated in the past few years. I would say that I got into racing about 7 years ago, and the technology was pretty rudimentary. It's a lot of folks in their basements trying to hack together technology from different spaces that hadn't really come together before, helicopters, planes, and trying to bring that into an experience that can become this new thing that the people had never done before. In addition to that, a lot of the video technology was far behind, and we were kind of handicapped by that. But nowadays, you can download a simulator on your computer and practice for 24 hours a day, and that's how the guys who are the top of the world are training now is in simulators.
Was your initial interest in drones coming from a competitive perspective, or was it, here's another thing I want to explore?
Yeah, I think it bridges a few things for me. So being an industrial designer, drone racing was an opportunity to actually design my own drones. So it's very rare that everyone flies the same thing. There are specific leagues, and we can talk about that, where you fly the same thing. But for the most part, everyone's flying a completely different drone. And so I saw it as an opportunity to actually sit down, design, and build my own stuff. So I design the frames, I get the carbon fiber cuts, I assemble everything, and it's kind of unique to me. So that was a huge draw for me because it kind of kept me active in the physical design space. Having shifted over to digital design, I like keeping my toes in the physical world because there's something about a physical product that is very rewarding when it comes to fruition. Unlike well, digital products can be rewarding as well, but they move at completely different paces and have completely different risks associated with the development of those products. So anyways, physical products have always been fun for me, so I kind of keep doing that. I do like electronics, so there's obviously an aspect of, you know, soldering your own stuff and kind of piecing together all these components that are unique to your build. And then the real challenge for me, at least, is flying the things, which I'd say, you know, when I started, there were no simulators. There was nothing on your computer that you could learn from. It was put it up in the air and see if you can keep it up in the air. And it kind of sounds silly to say because, you know, people listening might be like, well, you know, I put my DJI up in the air and it just kind of hovers there. But you don't really realize that there's a lot of software that's doing that, right? That's making sure that drone isn't flying into a tree and then falling out of the sky. And this is not software that we use in drone racing. It's all your thumbs. It's all in your hands. There's nothing stopping that drone from crashing into the ground or a tree or any sort of obstacle. So that's where the skill comes in, is to be able to navigate through an obstacle course, and then to do it at speed is that next challenge.
So you said you were really interested in designing your own drones. How do you start designing a drone? Are there any guidelines that you start from and sort of develop your own style, or how does it work?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of need to know what you want, of course, to begin with. You can't just say, well, I want a drone, because they come in all shapes and sizes and every different scale imaginable. Once you start racing, you kind of understand what type of drone works for you, like what kind of setup works for you. The drone racing community is categorized into certain buckets. So you have like kind of an open class, which still has some parameters around, you know, the requirements for the drone size and whatnot. And so once you kind of figure out what bucket you're in, you just kind of need to play with, I guess, existing frames and existing drones and kind of figure out what works for you and your style. You know, I've been doing this long enough that I have a preference in my setup and a preference in, you know, what I want out of my drone. So you just kind of start with that, and then to actually build it, right? So 3D software is where I start, and I model everything in 3D, pass it over to the CNC company, and you're pretty much done. The nice thing is they're relatively simple machines. You know, we use plate CNC, 5mm, 6mm kind of stuff. It's very simple. The actual 3D printed components on it, you know, generally TPU, customized to your camera setup or your antenna setup, but overall, like, they're very basic. We fly these things very fast into objects very hard, and you need to be able to repair them very quickly. They're not like your DJIs with big fancy plastic covers and everything's protected. We're throwing them into the dirt as hard as possible, kind of thing.
And sorry, when you say DJI, what are you referring to?
I usually just, the DJI, I think, is just kind of the name that people understand when it comes to consumer drones. So a lot of people will have like the Mini, which bypasses a lot of the regulations, and we can talk about regulations. But yeah, I just kind of use that as the generic term for a drone, because I think most people will understand that name more than anything else.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. So you did mention leagues and regulations. Let's dive into the exciting world of competitive drone racing.
Yeah, so it's pretty structured, surprisingly. At least here in North America, we have a variety of different leagues. There's a big one called MultiGP. That's kind of the main governing body. They have, you know, I guess the biggest structure, the most number of pilots. They do big events every year. We have leagues around what is called X-Class. So people can't see this, but behind me, I have very large X-Class drones, which are kind of 800 millimeters in size. And there's a special league just for that. There are special leagues for what we call tiny whoops, which are, you know, 65 millimeter size drones, like really tiny stuff you can fly in your house. Yeah, you just kind of pick your preference in terms of what you want to race in. I end up racing in all of them because I find all of it interesting. But there's no doubt that government regulations have kind of curbed some of the drone racing experience. So for those not aware, most parts of the world, anything over 250 250 grams starts to get regulated pretty heavily. And that's why you see DJI releasing something called the Mini, which is 249 grams. It's basically the biggest drone you can fly anywhere except Class F airspace, which is like airports and the White House kind of thing. That regulation has turned a lot of people off of drone racing because now we require special insurance that's done in collaboration with the government to make sure that, we're vetted and we're safe what we're doing. So, people are just buying consumer drones and flying them in their neighbor's backyard. This is kind of hurt the industry for us, because I would say that the majority of racing drones are over that 249 grams. They're bigger. That's just what they are. But yeah, the regulations have kind of really put a damper on drone racing. It's recovered a little bit as people create these kind of safe spaces for drone racing. These kind of regulated bodies have stood up, and we have sanctioned fields that have been okayed by the government as places that we can do this. But there's a lot of restrictions even for that. We don't fly high when we're racing. The tallest element might be 20 feet in the air, and that's kind of it. We're not going 400 feet in the air for the most part, unless something, of course, breaks or something happens. It's happened before where, a drone just hits something and takes off vertically. It's always a risk, but it's extremely rare and not intentional for sure.
So what happens at a race?
Yeah, so the races, just kind of dependent on how many categories are racing, whether it's the general open class, which is kind of the most common. But basically, we leveraged multi-GP platform to organize all of the racing. Here in Ottawa, at least, we're a sanctioned body. We're a sanctioned fields. We've been, we're like a tier 1, which is the top tier organization. Anyway, so you show up to a race, we set up a track. So sometimes we will run what they call qualifier tracks. So this is the governing body of multi-GP putting out very detailed specifications about the track layout and dimensions. So detailed that you actually have to submit a form to them with dimensions that aren't listed on the drawings to confirm that you have actually set up the track correctly. But we set up the track. Generally, you have a bunch of practice rounds just to make sure you're familiar with the track, because a lot of the times the track is just something we made up on the spot. So you don't know, like, hey, is it good? Is it not good? For some reason, I tend to be the person making the tracks. I guess I'm pretty good at track making. But yeah, it's practice. And then the way that we typically race is your top time in 3 laps. So the fastest 3 laps is how we're ranked. And so it's kind of an open session. We can do as many laps, packs, whatever we want as we go. The fastest top 3 is kind of the winner of the day. As you kind of scale up the competitions, so we do here in Canada, we do a Canadian Nationals. I've hosted the Canadian Nationals before, and that's where you start to get into different categories within the classes. So you'll have pro class, you have pro, and you'll have sport class as well. So basically, you do the same kind of ranking. You take that top 3 lap times, and then you get categorized into pro versus sport. And from there, you do bracket elimination. So round by round, you're competing in heads-up racing rather than timed racing. And, the top 2 will go on and kind of continue down the line until you get to the finals. There's an interesting thing in the multi-GP world where it's called, I believe, Ironman, which is basically once you get to that final round, you have to win twice. But if you have won everything all the way up to that point, you only have to win once because basically you're so good that no one's going to beat you anyways, is kind of the theory. So it's always fun to see if folks can actually achieve the Ironman.
So how long are those tracks?
We generally go by, so let's say physical size. So you kind of have like a 100 by 200 foot or 100 by 250 foot space that the tracks will generally fit in. That's not a strict requirements by any means. They run much bigger tracks. There is a league called the DRL, which some folks might be familiar. You can actually watch it on ESPN. And this is where they're racing through giant stadiums or giant buildings or massive outdoor spaces. Different leagues, different kind of structure to that. For the hobbyist, it's generally about that size. There's no requirement in terms of length of track or number of turns or anything. It's just kind of confined to that space.
And you mentioned you design tracks in addition to designing drones. What makes a good track? And what makes a bad track?
Yeah, that's a good question. It feels like it's one of those things that I've been into racing, whether it's competing and the remote control side or just watching and consuming racing. Like I'm a big MotoGP fan. I've watched F1 for decades. I'm one of the guys who likes NASCAR. I don't know. I think just seeing and observing all these tracks around the world and how people fly, and just an understanding of, you know, what makes a good corner, what makes a good feature, what makes a good kind of obstacle to go around, and how those obstacles flow together. It's just in my head. I can't really explain it. It's just one of those things that I can really visualize how the drone would fly through the track as I build it, because I don't even draw it out. I just walk out there and I just pretend like I'm the drone, and I can see what it's going to be like what's going to be the challenge and what's going to be easy, and where you're going to carry too much speed into a corner versus where you have to make a tight maneuver. One of the big things in drone racing is overlaps of racing lines. So when you're car racing, you have one racing line, right? Because it's 2 dimensions. But the second you add a third dimension, all of a sudden you can easily cross paths in many scenarios. So you have to be really cognizant of that, and also the skill of the pilots who are racing. So sometimes, you know, if we get a lot of new folks out, we'll make a simpler track to make sure that they're having fun and they're not, you know, super stressed about missing a gate or a tight turn. So that's kind of nice, right? We have that flexibility, whereas in road racing, you're really fixed to wherever they put the pavement. So it's kind of nice.
Does that mean that head-to-head racing for drones is also something that is reserved to more advanced pilots because they need to be cognizant of what the other drone is doing, not just the track itself?
I would say it's not reserved for anything in particular. Locally, we tend to do it a little bit less because the risk is higher for breaking the drone, and the risk is higher for having more collisions, and nobody wants to break anything and spend money on this stuff. So we kind of fall back to, well, we'll just go to the 3 lap times. But there are organizations and places that do tons of heads up racing, and that's where it's kind of critical to bracket people based off of their 3 lap times. So then you have, you know, the top 4 folks are going to be pretty close, so they'll be good, and the bottom 4 folks will be really bad. But it's actually a good thing, because that means they're probably never going to be close to each other, because they're not that great.
One thing that we know as designers in general is that no matter how much we plan for, we're always going to find surprises when someone gets to use what we designed. Is that something that happens with tracks as well? You design a track and then you find that someone is flying it in a way that you did not expect at all.
I'd say a little bit. So it's kind of interesting. I think everyone has a dominant side, right? A left or a right. And the same thing happens in drone racing. You're more confident turning left or right, even though your body's not turning. Your brain is doing the turning. And so what's interesting is there is definitely a difference between the top guys and the bottom ones in terms of the lines that they take. I know for myself, like, I'm significantly faster turning in one direction versus the other. So I will deliberately take an obstacle, you know, using my dominant side versus not. But other folks might have a different dominant side. There is generally a line, like a racing line, like you would have in motorsports, but there are no rules to say you can't be off the racing line. And because the racing line lives in 3D, it's actually really hard to follow that racing line. Just to kind of build off of that, so one of the leagues, or a couple of the leagues, have started to focus on what we call spec racing. You see this a little bit actually a lot in motorsports as well. NASCAR is probably the biggest proponent of this, but every motorsport has some form of specs for the car that you're racing with. But now in drone racing, there are leagues that are extremely specific about those specs so that the racing can be even tighter. And that's where taking the right line is absolutely critical, because at least in these leagues, they've deliberately underpowered the quad because it really makes the competition super close. With these open classes, my power versus someone else's could be very, very different. But in these spec leagues, all of a sudden you have just crazy tight racing because everyone has exactly the same quad, exactly the same power restriction, and there's so little power that you can't do your typical, punch outs or accelerations that you do in a big one. So now all of a sudden your line becomes extremely critical. You have to carry that speed, much like you would in, say, like a lower class of motorsports, like you're racing a Miata, right? Versus an F1 car. You have to carry that speed because you just can't pick up and accelerate fast enough.
So I'm curious to go back to that first race you participated in. Tell me about that experience. I'm assuming, show up with your drone. What's the feeling? How was that first time racing a drone?
Yeah, so I would say my circumstances were a little bit unique. My first race was in the wintertime, and for anyone in the north, winter means snow, which means that we raced indoors, and we actually raced in one of those large sport bubble dome things. And I was absolutely terrified because not only had I barely ever flown before, but I'd never raced. And now I'm inside of this giant bubble, which I could definitely pop with my drone. Like, the blades are sharp enough to pop that bubble. I was terrified. Thankfully, nothing happened and it was all good. But, that first time taking off, you're just like, I don't know what's going to happen. You're like, am I going to go straight into the dome and slice it open and be in big trouble? Or, are we going to live through this and be okay? One of the things that we do now with new folks is, we don't start them indoors because that's insane to do. But when we go outdoors, we tell folks just to follow the track, but above it. Like, don't try to go through a gate. It's harder than it sounds to go through a gate. And so you just kind of mimic the track, but you stay well above it. So you just kind of get the flow of it. And that seems to help people a lot. We've run tracks that are extremely simple, like basic ovals, to help people kind of get accustomed to flying through it. And, you add in 2 or 3 gates and they just get comfortable going through the gates. So yeah, the best thing is to kind of ease into it. But this is where the simulators really help. So now that simulators are kind of the de facto standard, you don't need a massive investment to figure out if you're going to like this or not, because it's challenging, right? Like, it's not an easy thing to start and to actually do. And to spend the money to buy all of this equipment is very expensive. But now you can buy a controller for $100, hook it up to your computer. You buy the simulator for $20 or $30, whatever it is, and you can spend countless hours getting really good. And what we're seeing is the people who start that way come out to the field, come out to the first race so far ahead of where they would have been if they didn't have the simulator.
What's the community aspect of these leagues? Like, is it each person to themselves, or do you show up with a group of people? Is there camaraderie between the participants? How does it work?
Yeah, there's definitely a community. We all understand that A, this is challenging, B, this is expensive, and C, it's really complex. Not necessarily that the racing is complex, but the actual drones themselves can have just an insane number of issues, and you're always trying to solve the issues because you're not buying like an off-the-shelf drone, right? You're piecing it together. And so if it's not perfect, if it's not tuned perfectly to your exact setup, you're going to have issues. And so the community is always there to kind of help people solve that or help fill in the gaps, or maybe you broke something and this person has a part that happens to work, and you share in that sense. It definitely gets to the point where you're there's a lot of camaraderie around the race, and You can break out the cowbell and try to distract people. And the other thing to think about is like heads up racing mentally is completely different than timed racing. So while you're going through timed racing to set your bracket, the second you get to that heads up racing, the entire race changes. So all of a sudden speeds get a little bit slower because pilots are really cognizant of not hitting anything and not screwing up. But you can't go too slow because you've trained your brain on that track to go a certain speed. So there's kind of this fine balance of, well, I can't screw up, right? Because then I'm out, but I still need to finish. So you just kind of go fast enough to win, and fast enough that the timing of your hands kind of works with the track. So once you get to that level, like the community is like, it's a little bit different, right? Like it's more of a mental game than anything. So you're trying to kind of psych people out and kind of make sure that you can finish ahead of them.
What are some tips that you have for people who are listening to this and thinking, I wonder if drone racing is something that is right for me?
Definitely, if you're interested, grab a controller, grab a simulator, and try it out. You're going to get extremely frustrated the first time. The first 20 times, the first 50 times are going to be mind-numbingly frustrating because you're not going to be able to get through any gates and you're going to crash every 2 seconds. But it's worth it, right? Like it's so much cheaper to approach it from that perspective than it is to go spend $1,500 on equipment and literally do exactly the same thing, crash every 2 seconds. It's for folks who want that challenge, who strive for perfecting that kind of challenge, but also have an interest in the actual like building of the drones. I think that's, it's kind of 50% of the hobby, to sit down on the bench, solder things together, build the drone that you want to build with, whatever technology it is that you want to fly with. Because there are a million choices. But yeah, I mean, it's super interesting. I think it's really for that person who enjoys a good challenge. I would say it took me 3 years to be competitive. Without any simulators, it was really kind of 3 years before I was able to compete at any level. So it doesn't come fast. There are guys who are happy just not really competing too. Like it's fun to fly. Like just pretend that you're flying up in the sky and doing all these tricks and flying around. It's a feeling that is hard to describe, but it's kind of amazing at the same time.
Is it something that's giving you the desire to fly other vessels?
Not me personally, although there are a lot of folks in that community. Like a lot of folks come from the plane community, so that's kind of a natural progression for them. There are some local pilots that have gone to like paramotor type stuff. So actually that's where, you strap the big fan to your back and you sit in a little cart and you've got a parachute kind of thing on the top. For me, no, this is more than enough, but this is fun too. So I can't complain.
So you've built drones, you've designed tracks. What's next for you in the world of drone racing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so on the big X class stuff, I've been a world champion on that. On the kind of normal open class, last year I was 8th in Canada. I'd like to get better at it. There's a plateau. It feels like there's a plateau for me, right? Like what we see is a lot of the young kids who have better reaction times and no arthritis in their hands, they're performing really, really well. For me, it's a hobby, right? I want to be able to compete at a level that makes it fun. So, not crashing, but I'm not out there to win it all anymore. The good news is we're moving out to the country this year, so I'll have my own track at my house and I'll be able to practice a lot more. But it's a fun community. It's COVID really hurt the community, and it's starting to come back now that things have settled down and now that some of the regulations have been managed a little bit better. So it's good to see the community grow. What's also interesting is, how drone technology is expanding far beyond consumer level and far beyond the racing level as well. It's interesting to see the whole space continue to evolve and change every year. It's nonstop. Better technologies, making it easier to build this stuff, making it somewhat cheaper to build this stuff, but also just the demand for FPV pilots going up. It was once a dream to do it as a job, and now you can do it as a job. It's crazy.
Ian, where can people find you?
You can find me on Threads, on Instagram, just Ian Murchison on both of those. Of course, if anyone wants to reach out on LinkedIn, I'm always available there as well. I do love a lot of other things, as you mentioned. If you want to talk farming and hops, you want to talk drones, you want to talk design systems, design, industrial design. I've got way too many hobbies, that's for sure.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Ian.
Awesome. Thank you.
This is all for this episode of Design Downtime. Thank you for joining me. And until next time, I hope you enjoy your downtime.